There is a choke point in the Persian Gulf, 54 kilometers wide at its narrowest passage, flanked by Iran to the north and Oman to the south, through which approximately 20% of the world's traded oil flows every single day. Military strategists have a specific term for places like this. They call them critical maritime choke points, and they rank them by what happens to the global economy if they close. Hormuz sits at the top of that list. If it were blocked, economists estimate that oil prices would spike within 72 hours. Supply chains would begin fracturing within 2 weeks, and the cascading effects would reach every economy on Earth within a month. It is, in the bluntest possible terms, the jugular vein of the modern world. The word Hormuz did not exist in 553 BC. The strait had no name in any language spoken along the Tigris or the Euphrates. Mesopotamian cartographers had never mapped it. Persian navigators knew the waters, but no written record in Hebrew, Aramaic, or any Semitic language referred to that corridor by any name at all. It was simply where the Gulf narrowed before opening into the Arabian Sea. And yet there is a text written in Babylon in the 6th century before Christ by an elderly Jewish exile who had arrived there in chains as a 15-year-old boy that describes a final military campaign ending with a king planting his royal tents between the seas at a specific distance from what the prophet calls the glorious holy mountain. A text that names the geopolitical actors involved, that identifies the roles of North and South, that traces lines of military movement across a map that no scribe of the ancient Near East could have drawn from observation alone. That text is the Book of Daniel, and to understand what it describes in its final chapters, you need to first understand who Daniel actually was, not the Sunday school figure of the handsome young man who walks out of the lion's den without a scratch, but the real Daniel of the biblical text. An old man of more than 80 years, sitting on the bank of the Tigris River, eyes sunken from 21 days of fasting, white hair loose over his shoulders, hands open in the dust, watching the slow current move south toward the Gulf, toward the corridor that his readers, 26 centuries later, know as the Strait of Hormuz. The story begins with chains on a teenager's wrists. When Nebuchadnezzar descended on Judah after his victory at the Battle of Carchemish, he took 2 things from Jerusalem. He took the sacred vessels of the temple, and he took people. Specifically, he took young men from the Judean nobility, physically sound, intellectually sharp, socially refined, capable of serving in the palace of a great king. Daniel was among them, along with his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Think about what that looked like from the inside. 15 years old, soldiers speaking a language you don't understand, shackles on your wrists and ankles. The last view of Jerusalem's hills disappearing behind you as the column of captives moves north, skirting the desert. And you understand, with the particular clarity that only a 15-year-old who has just lost everything can have, that you are never going back. For a young Jew of the 6th century BC, exile was not merely geographic displacement, it was theological catastrophe. The temple in Jerusalem was the axis around which all of reality organized itself, the one place on earth where the visible presence of Yahweh dwelt between the cherubim behind the veil of the Holy of Holies. To be torn from Jerusalem was to be torn from the only place where God was tangibly present, or at least, that was how it looked from inside the marching column of captives, walking away from everything they had ever known. Babylon, when it appeared on the horizon, was simply incomprehensible to anyone who had grown up in Judah. The double walls, the Ishtar Gate with its glazed blue lions and dragons, the ziggurats rising above the plain like artificial mountains, their peaks disappearing into the morning haze, the Hanging Gardens, built by Nebuchadnezzar for his Median wife who missed the mountains of her homeland. A 15-year-old Jewish boy entering the capital of the most powerful empire in the known world, with shackles on his ankles and an empty chest where his sense of God's presence used to be. The first thing they did was rename him. Daniel means, God is my judge. That name had no place in the court of a pagan king. He became Belteshazzar, a Babylonian name invoking Bel, the patron deity of the city. His 3 friends were renamed as well. Hananiah became Shadrach, Mishael became Meshach, Azariah became Abednego. The names of foreign gods pressed over the identities of young men who belonged to the people of Yahweh. They had taken the city, the family, the language, the name, and then came the food. The king had arranged that the young men in training for royal service would eat from the king's own table, meat, wine, delicacies from the palace kitchens. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food. This was not religious theater, it was identity. The food was the last frontier, the one thing the Babylonians had not yet managed to overwrite. And Daniel defended it, not with a speech, not with a confrontation, but with something far more characteristic of who he actually was, a negotiation. He asked the chief eunuch for a 10-day trial, only vegetables and water. If at the end of 10 days he and his friends looked worse than the other young men, he would accept the king's food. The eunuch agreed. At the end of 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends were visibly healthier than all the others. The detail seems almost trivial against the backdrop of everything that follows, but it reveals the architecture of Daniel's character, a man who knows exactly what he cannot compromise and finds the most intelligent possible way not to compromise it. That is the Daniel who would later interpret the dreams of kings, survive the lions, and receive visions at the edge of the Tigris that would be written down and sealed for 26 centuries. In the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, the king had a dream. Not an ordinary dream, the kind you shake off in the morning, but a dream that left him sitting upright in the dark, his heart hammering, unable to go back to sleep. He summoned every class of wise man in Babylon, magicians, astrologers, sorcerers, Chaldeans, every category of person who claimed access to hidden knowledge. And then he imposed a condition that was, by any rational standard, impossible. He would not tell them the dream. They had to know it by themselves. If they truly had the powers they claimed, they should be able to tell him both what he had dreamed and what it meant. No one could. Nebuchadnezzar ordered the execution of every wise man in his empire. Daniel was classified among them and was therefore condemned. He requested an audience with the king, asked for time, and spent the night in prayer with his 3 friends. By morning, the dream had been revealed to him in a vision. The king had seen a massive statue of terrifying appearance. Its head was pure gold, its chest and arms silver, its belly and thighs bronze, its legs iron, and its feet a mixture of iron and baked clay. While the king watched it, a stone cut without human hands struck the statue at its feet of iron and clay. The entire statue collapsed. The iron, clay, bronze, silver, and gold shattered together into dust that the wind swept away like chaff from a threshing floor. And the stone that had struck the statue grew until it became a great mountain that filled the whole earth. Daniel presented the dream to Nebuchadnezzar, word for word, image for image. The king did not move. That was exactly what he had dreamed. And then Daniel gave an interpretation that has structured prophetic reading ever since. The head of gold was Nebuchadnezzar himself, the Babylonian Empire. After him would come another kingdom, inferior to his, represented by silver. Then a 3rd kingdom of bronze that would rule over the whole earth. Then a 4th kingdom, strong as iron, that would crush and break everything else. But the feet of that 4th kingdom would be mixed, part iron, part clay, strong in appearance, but brittle at the joints. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven would establish a kingdom that would never be destroyed. 3 of the 4 empires fulfilled themselves in the historical record with a precision that secular historians note, whether or not they have any theological interest in the text. After Babylon came Persia. Cyrus the Great entered Babylon in 539 BC, famously without significant bloodshed inside the city walls, exactly as the silver of Daniel's vision implied, inferior in glory, but broader in reach. After Persia came Greece. Alexander crossed the Hellespont in 334 BC, defeated Darius III at Gaugamela, and extended his empire from the Balkans to the Indus Valley in 11 years. Bronze over everything. And after Greece came Rome, the Iron, the one empire that Daniel had described as crushing and breaking, rather than absorbing or assimilating. The one that left no previous culture intact. 3 empires in sequence, with the qualities Daniel had described. The only element that many commentators argue remains only partially fulfilled is the ending. The feet of iron mixed with clay and the stone that strikes them. Daniel lived long enough to see the first empire fall and the second rise. He was present in the palace of Belshazzar, co-regent of the last Babylonian king, the night that what history remembers as the writing on the wall occurred. Belshazzar, drunk on wine at a great banquet, ordered the sacred vessels Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the Jerusalem temple to be brought out, and used them as drinking cups for himself, his wives, his concubines, his nobles. That is the moment the text chooses to describe next. A hand, without any visible body attached to it, writing on the plaster wall of the palace by the light of the lampstands. 4 words in Aramaic. The king's color drained from his face, his knees knocked together. His wise men could not read it. His astrologers could not read it. And then the Queen Mother, who remembered an older generation of the court, spoke a name that the current generation had forgotten. Daniel, the old Jewish man, the one who had served Nebuchadnezzar, the one who interpreted dreams. Daniel walked into the banquet hall and read the inscription without hesitation. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin, numbered, weighed, divided. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That night, Belshazzar was killed. The Persians entered the city. Daniel did not read that chapter in a scroll. He witnessed it. The Babylonian Empire ended in front of his eyes. It was under the new empire, under Darius the Mede, that Daniel faced the episode most closely associated with his name. He was over 80 years old by this point, one of 3 chief governors over the largest empire in the known world. The other administrators, envious of his position and of the evident trust Darius placed in him, engineered a trap of elegant precision. They persuaded the king to sign a decree forbidding any petition to any god or man other than the king himself for 30 days. The penalty was the lion's den. Daniel knew about the decree, and 3 times a day, as he had done since he was 15 years old and newly arrived in chains, he opened the windows of his house toward Jerusalem and prayed. His enemies found him there. They went to the king. Darius understood too late the trap he had stepped into. The law of the Medes and Persians could not be revoked, not even by the king who had signed it. At sundown, Daniel was led to the den. The king sealed the entrance with his own ring. He did not eat that night. He did not sleep. At dawn, he ran to the den and called Daniel's name in a voice that the text says was strained with anguish. And from inside the den, a voice answered, "My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me." Daniel emerged without a wound. Those who had accused him were thrown in with their wives and their children. The lions, the text says with a brevity that is itself a kind of eloquence, overpowered them before they even reached the floor of the den. Daniel survived. He continued serving. He continued fasting. He continued receiving visions. The most geographically specific, the most historically dense, the most disturbing for a reader with a modern map in hand, came in the final years of his life. when his body was exhausted, but his mind, sharpened by decades of prayer and fasting, was capable of receiving what it received on the bank of the Tigris. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, Daniel was beside the Tigris River, 3 weeks into a fast. No choice food, no meat, no wine, not even the use of lotions, which in the Persian court carried the social weight of deliberate mourning. He was mourning, almost certainly, for his people. The Jews had begun returning to Jerusalem after Cyrus's decree, but the reconstruction had stalled. Opposition from neighboring peoples, poverty, discouragement. Daniel was too old to make the journey. He prayed for those who had. On the 24th day of that fast, he raised his eyes from the ground and saw a figure whose description the text renders in terms that resist comfortable reading. Clothed in linen, with a belt of pure gold from Upaz, his body like beryl, his face like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a multitude. The men who were with Daniel did not see the vision, but they felt that something had changed in the air around them. They fled to hide. Daniel stood alone. At the sight of the figure, every ounce of strength left his body. He fell face down on the ground as if dead, his hands open in the dust, the hands that had sustained 70 years of royal service now utterly emptied. A hand touched him, helped him to his knees, still trembling. And the voice said something that permanently reframed the way attentive readers have understood the relationship between prayer and the invisible world ever since. Do not be afraid, Daniel. From the first day you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God, your words were heard. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia opposed me for 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me. 21 days, the exact duration of Daniel's fast, while the old man lay prostrated on the bank of the Tigris, eating only vegetables, listening to the river move south toward the Gulf, thinking about Jerusalem. There had been a conflict in a dimension his physical eyes could not see. A territorial conflict, a spiritual conflict over the influence governing the Persian Empire. And this conflict was intense enough that the heavenly messenger required reinforcement, specifically the angel Michael, identified elsewhere in Daniel as the prince who stands guard over Israel. The prince of Persia, not a human general, not a court official. A spiritual entity associated with Persian territory, resisting the divine messenger for 21 days over the same ground where Daniel was fasting, where the Tigris was flowing, where the Persian Gulf opened to the south, where the corridor that the modern world calls Hormuz connected that region to the open ocean. The messenger also told Daniel that when he returned, he would have to continue the conflict against the prince of Persia, and that after that, the prince of Greece would come. The next two empires in the statue's sequence were already present here, not only as historical entities, but as territorial spiritual forces. What the messenger had come to reveal was in the chapter that follows. Daniel 11 is one of the strangest and most forensically precise passages in the entire Bible. 35 verses describing, with an almost surgical level of detail, more than 300 years of wars between two powers referred to as the King of the South and the King of the North. The identification of these kingdoms by commentators is nearly unanimous. The King of the South is the Ptolemaic kingdom centered in Egypt, founded by Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals. The King of the North is the Seleucid kingdom, centered in Syria, founded by Seleucus, another of Alexander's generals. Between them, the land they both wanted to control, the corridor that served as the theater of every one of these wars, was Judea, the land of Daniel's people. The text moves through those wars with specificity that is almost uncomfortable. The marriage alliance is sealed and then betrayed. The princesses sent north to cement treaties that dissolved within a generation. The military campaigns that advance and then retreat. The palace assassinations, the broken agreements. Historians who study the Hellenistic period without any theological interest in the passage can place Daniel 11 alongside the records of Polybius and Diodorus Siculus and find correspondence verse by verse. The sequence culminates in a specific Seleucid king of the north. Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who invaded Egypt twice, was humiliated by the Roman envoy in what history remembers as the Day of Eleusis, returned through Judea in fury, and unleashed a persecution of the Jewish people of a brutality that had no precedent in their history. The temple desecrated, a statue of Zeus installed in the Holy of Holies, a pig sacrificed on the altar, the Torah scrolls destroyed, circumcision and the Sabbath banned under penalty of death. The abomination of desolation that Daniel had described in chapter 9. Up to verse 35, the text maps onto history with a precision that has troubled rationalist scholars for 2 centuries, because the book claims to have been written in the 6th century BC, and the events it describes in detail occurred in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. At verse 36, the text shifts. The king it now describes does not match the historical profile of Antiochus IV. This king acts according to his own will. He exalts himself above every god. He speaks astonishing things against the God of gods. He shows no regard for the gods of his fathers, nor for the one beloved by women, nor for any god, but exalts himself above all. He honors a god of fortresses, a god his ancestors did not know. Then verses 40 through 45 lay out a sequence of military movements. At the time of the end, the king of the south attacks him. The king of the north comes against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen and many ships. He passes through countries, enters the beautiful land, extends his hand against the lands, seizes the treasures of gold and silver of Egypt, and passes through Libya and Ethiopia as well. And then verse 45, he shall plant his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, with none to help him, between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. The sea, in Hebrew Yamim, a plural form. And that royal encampment is positioned between those seas and the mountain that Hebrew prophetic literature consistently identifies as Jerusalem, specifically Mount Zion, where the temple stood. The traditional reading identifies the seas as the Mediterranean to the west and the Dead Sea to the east, with Jerusalem between them. That reading is legitimate. It is the most widely held interpretation. But there is a second reading that a growing number of commentators, particularly in recent decades, have found difficult to set aside when they read the text with a modern map open beside it. That reading proposes that the seas of verse 45 may refer not to the Mediterranean and the Dead Sea, but to a geographical corridor further east, where 2 large bodies of water meet at a point of extreme narrowness. The Persian Gulf to the north and the Arabian Sea to the south, joined by a stretch of water 54 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, Hormuz. The same gulf into which the Tigris and Euphrates empty from the northwest. The same Tigris on whose bank Daniel had fallen face down in the dust when he received the last of his visions. The same waters through which any military force identified with Persia would have to pass to reach the open ocean. This is not a claim of certainty. The traditional reading remains both possible and widely held. But the geographic observation, made with modern satellite imagery available, is genuinely difficult to ignore. Because if the description of verse 45 contemplates a corridor between bodies of water to the east and south of Jerusalem, the geography that most precisely fits that description on a modern map is not the Mediterranean Dead Sea pairing, where Jerusalem sits on relatively high ground between them, but the corridor between the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, where today sits the single most strategically significant maritime choke point on Earth. Daniel is not the only prophetic voice that converges on this geography. Centuries before him, on the bank of a different river, the Chebar in northern Mesopotamia, Ezekiel was also in exile. Ezekiel did not see the four-empire statue or the kings of the north and south. He saw a coalition, a named coalition, of peoples descending from the north against the mountains of Israel in what the text places explicitly in the latter days. Gog, of the land of Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Persia, Cush, Gomer, Togarmah. Ezekiel lists them by name, one after another. 1,000 years after Ezekiel, the Jewish historian Josephus would identify Magog with the Scythians north of the Black Sea. Assyrian inscriptions identify Meshech and Tubal with peoples called Musku and Tabal, who inhabited what is today eastern Turkey. And Persia, Ezekiel names directly, with the same name the Persians used for themselves, the same name that survives today in its modern form as the country that sits at the northern edge of the Persian Gulf, whose official name is the Islamic Republic of Iran. Ezekiel names Persia as a military participant in a final coalition against Israel. Any scenario in which Iran deployed naval forces would require passage through Hormuz. Not as a secondary consideration, but as the only route from any Iranian port on the Gulf to open water. It is the mandatory corridor. Ezekiel does not name Hormuz. He could not have. The name did not exist. But he names Persia, and Hormuz is the throat through which Persia reaches the sea. Centuries later still, a volcanic island in the Aegean called Patmos, the last of the 12 apostles, exiled by the Emperor Domitian, received a series of visions he recorded in the Book of Revelation. Among many other things, he saw 7 angels with 7 bowls. When the 6th angel poured out his bowl, something specific happened on the great river Euphrates. Its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east, the great rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the rivers whose banks Daniel had inhabited for 7 decades, the rivers that flow into the gulf that narrows at Hormuz, appear again in the prophetic framework of the end of days. 3 prophetic voices, 3 different centuries, 3 different languages and literary contexts, and all of them oriented toward the same geography, the Mesopotamian corridor, descending south through the Tigris and Euphrates, opening into the Persian Gulf, narrowing at the 54 kilometers of Hormuz, giving passage to the Arabian Sea and the maritime routes that connect the Gulf to the global economy. There is an honesty that needs to be stated here plainly. Every generation that has read the book of Daniel since the 1st century has believed, to varying degrees, that it was living in the final days the text describes. The Christians of the 1st century saw in Rome the 4th Empire in its final configuration. The reformers of the 16th century saw in the papacy the figure of the king who exalts himself above every god. Interpreters of the 19th and early 20th centuries saw in the rising European powers the final geopolitical alignment. None of them saw the fulfillment they expected. The book remained closed over all of them. And yet there is an objective difference between what those generations had before them and what the present generation has. Israel had not existed as a sovereign political entity in its historical territory for approximately 1900 years before 1948. It does now. Persia, under whatever name it has carried across the centuries, continues to be a political entity in the same territory that Ezekiel called Persia, and that today is governed by a regime that publicly and consistently declares its intention to eliminate the State of Israel. The Middle East is the center of global geopolitical tension in a way that is qualitatively different from any previous period in the past 2,000 years. And there exists, for the first time in recorded human history, a maritime choke point whose control determines the functioning of the entire global economy, located in the precise geometry that the prophets described. None of that is proof that we are in the time of the end. But it is a configuration of elements that previous generations simply did not have. And that difference is worth taking seriously. Daniel asked the angel at the very end of his book the question every honest reader of the text wants to ask. My Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things? The answer he received is one of the most quoted and least understood statements in all of prophetic literature. Go, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end. Many shall be purified and made white and refined, but the wicked shall act wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but those who are wise shall understand. Shut up and sealed until the time of the end. Not because God was hiding truth arbitrarily, but because the full comprehension of certain prophecies depends on a historical configuration that had not yet arrived. When it arrived, the words would open, not for those seeking intellectual novelty or prophetic sensationalism, but for the wise, for those who had set their hearts to understand, which is precisely the phrase the angel used to describe why Daniel's prayers had been heard from the very first day. From the first day, you set your heart to understand. Daniel ended his book with a personal promise from the angel. But you shall go your way to the end, and shall rest, and shall rise to receive your inheritance at the end of the days. Daniel did not see the fulfillment. He rested. He was buried, most likely in Susa, the ancient Elamite capital, in the territory of the empire whose spiritual prince had resisted the heavenly messenger for 21 days over the very land where Daniel was fasting. Today, in the Iranian city of Shush, which corresponds to ancient Susa, there is a tomb that local tradition identifies as the tomb of Daniel. Iranian Muslims, Jews, and Christians all venerate it. Three religious communities that, according to Daniel's own book, will be on opposing sides of the conflict his visions describe, standing together at the grave of the man who described that conflict 26 centuries ago. The symmetry is not comfortable to look at directly. Daniel wrote in Persia about a final war in which Persia would have a role. He died in Persia. He is buried in Persia, in the same country whose modern name appears in the news every week in connection with exactly the tensions he describes. The prophet and the land of his prophecy share the same soil. And to the south of where he is buried, the waters of the Persian Gulf move toward the corridor that the entire world now monitors by satellite. 54 kilometers of water, illuminated at night by the lights of hundreds of oil tankers moving in both directions, watched by destroyers, tracked from orbit, calculated in global risk models, threatened in summit speeches, negotiated in military agreements. The Strait of Hormuz, the name Daniel never knew, the geography he described. The angel told Daniel that the words were sealed until the time of the end. He implied, by the very act of sealing them, that the time of the end would come, and that when it came, the words would open. Not all at once, not with a dramatic announcement, but gradually, as the historical landscape began to match the prophetic one, as readers with modern maps began to notice that the lines being drawn in geopolitical analysis looked, in their geography, like lines that had already been drawn in a different kind of ink on a different kind of page. Daniel himself never saw the Strait of Hormuz. He saw the Tigris moving south toward it. He lay face down on its bank while an invisible war was fought over the spiritual governance of the empire whose territory surrounds it. He wrote down what he was shown, sealed it as he was instructed, and rested. The river still runs south. The strait still narrows, and somewhere in the distance between what an old man saw in a vision on the bank of a river in 553 BC and what appears on a satellite screen tonight, a set of words that were sealed for 26 centuries may be, page by page, beginning to open.